Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Oshkosh 2022. This is aviation weather planning in ForeFlight. My name is Chris Mauser. I will be your host today. I am a customer success coordinator for ForeFlight. I've been with ForeFlight for about 3 years. Also a CFII, II, MEI, all the acronyms you need. A couple thousand hours of dual given. Jason, go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get started.
Sure. I'm a professional career CFI. I've been teaching flying in the San Francisco Bay Area for about the last 20 years. And so I actually started doing weather planning well before ForeFlight. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. But I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy that you all are here, and we're going to have a great talk.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. We really do appreciate it. Jason and I did a webinar, about last year, mid last year. Really enjoyed it. He and I had a chance to get to know each other. Great guy, a wealth of information and knowledge, and has lots of really good things to say. So thank you.
Sweet.
Today we're going to go over, some pretty straightforward stuff. We're not going to make it too complicated on y'all, but we do want you to walk away more knowledgeable and safer and able to operate ForeFlight easier in your everyday flying. So we're going to talk about some principles for effective briefing, okay? And then after we get through some of that, some of the standardization things that you can utilize, and Jason will explain kind of his take on that. We're going to walk through some different scenarios that you would do, whether that be staying local or starting to get out there and really cross the country. Jason, you've been teaching for a long time, right? Got a lot of real life experience.
Tons of real life experience. Yep.
Okay, so how has the weather planning in ForeFlight changed or shaped or evolved how you teach and approach weather planning?
Pretty much in all ways possible. But I think that the big thing that stands out to me, and how many folks here are new pilots, like just started flying maybe in the last 5 or 10 years? All right. How many folks have been flying for more than 10 years? All right, so all you folks remember what planning looked like before ForeFlight. And for those of you that don't, I can tell you it was pretty rough, Chris.
Yeah.
There weren't products that inspired confidence. We would have to always call for a weather briefing to a weather briefer. That was part of every single flight. You don't go flying unless you call a briefer and get a full briefing. Oftentimes when you were crossing the country, the briefers would tell you, well, there's a line of thunderstorms starting from 20 miles northwest of the Mustang VOR and 50 miles down. Then you have to just try to figure out what they're saying, where they're talking about. You try to get them to slow down. But the bottom line is a lot of it was guesswork. And because it was guesswork and didn't inspire confidence, those of us that were smart and still here flew very, very conservatively, right? Like many missions weren't executable. When there was any sign of convective activity, we would land. So I think one of the biggest differences is that ForeFlight provides a massive amount of weather intelligence. There's a ton of data in ForeFlight. You can just sit on your living room sofa and start, poking through ForeFlight and know more about the weather than the fanciest weather briefing system we had 20 years ago. But I think the important thing, and something you and I can get into here, is that back in the day, we had a very specific process, kind of the one I just described. You call for a briefing, you write it down, you go through a standard briefing or an abbreviated briefing or an Outlook briefing. With ForeFlight, I think part of our challenge, and you asked me how it's changed the way I teach it, part of the challenge is having some sort of standard approach to it. This is kind of funny, but I often use the analogy of the Titanic, the steamship that hit the iceberg. And the interesting thing about the accident with the Titanic is you had this brand new technology called a steam engine, right? And before that technology existed, you couldn't go 20 knots in a straight line on a calm night. It wasn't possible. If you wanted to go 20 knots, well, you couldn't. But if you wanted to go fast, it was windy, right? You had your sails up, the waves are breaking, they're hitting the icebergs, you could see everything really clearly. But in 1912, when the Titanic set sail, I think it was 1912, something like that, right? But when they set sail, they had this brand new technology, standing on the bridge, drinking their tea, confident in this technology. barreling down, through the ocean on a calm night, and what they failed to appreciate was they couldn't see the icebergs without the waves breaking against the bases of the icebergs. So I often joke with my students and I say, when we're learning ForeFlight, it's our job to figure out where the icebergs are and not get so over-reliant on the technology that we make a similar mistake, right? So we have to bring the wisdom of yesteryear into the technology of today, and I think the marriage of those two things, like we're going to talk about in this talk, is incredibly powerful, really, yeah.
Very cool. You mentioned to me a thing about what you call cherry picking. Can you kind of get into what you mean by cherry picking a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So as a CFI, I always like to give people a license to do what they're naturally going to do. Like if it's the way you're going to do it, I'd like to invent a system of safety that works. I don't want to try to fit a square peg into a round hole. So you can all probably appreciate this. The way I use ForeFlight often, and the way many of you probably use ForeFlight if you're anything like my students, is you sit down and you look at it and you think, well, what are the winds doing today? Or I wonder if there's any thunderstorms. Let's load the radar. Or what are the freezing levels today? Or any number of other things, right? You're just sitting there cherry picking is what I call it. You're just sort of looking at things randomly. And I like to give people a license to do that because it's what we all do anyway, and I don't want anybody lying to me or lying to themselves. But that's what I mean by cherry picking, is just sort of sitting down on your sofa or wherever you are and just guessing. And it's an okay thing to do, as we'll talk about in these 3 different weather scenarios, but it's also a little risky depending on the mission because of your own sort of bias, right? Like if, for example, you look up in the sky and you see a cloud, you might load radar. If it feels cold to you, you might check the freezing levels. If it's super windy, you might look at the surface winds. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to check the TFRs. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to check, the airmets and the sigmets. And so there's a lot of things that might be off your radar, so to speak, that you miss while you're cherry picking. So we'll talk about how that process works, but that's what I mean when I say cherry picking.
That really speaks to me because I'm way into human factors, right? That what you're trying to get here is that people are people. They're going to do things kind of the way they do it. As instructors, we do strive to offer you this, standardized approach to do things, but we all know that's kind of, there's still going to be those times where, like you said, you're just going to gravitate towards things, and it's okay to do that. And as long as that's a good starting point for you, because we want to then be able to build upon that depending on the mission, right? So.
Yeah, 100%. And you don't want to miss things. Like I'll tell you guys a real story. This is not something I'm proud of, but this is true. Doing my little cherry picking thing on ForeFlight, I'm going out on an IFR, training flight, little IFR mission with a great student. He's like a II candidate or something like that. So there's 2 experienced pilots in the airplane. And when we were cherry picking that morning, we looked at the bases of the clouds, we looked at the freezing levels, we looked at all the things that were relevant to our flight. But when we got out there and we're sitting in the run-up area and doing our run-up, the airport operations vehicle keys the mic and says, "You guys know the runway's closed today, right?" It's like, of course we know that. We're just doing a maintenance run, duh. Right? So, but we didn't think about it. We didn't think to check the NOTAMs at the airport, So you have to be careful when you're cherry picking and make sure that you have a system, like we'll talk about here today, that acts as a safety net to catch any of that stuff you might miss.
Yeah. You're all laughing because you've all been there. I know. Yeah.
They've never done anything like that.
Very cool. So, I have a very similar story. Driving to the airport, trying to get a briefing over the phone. You were mentioning earlier about how they just spit it out like they're, an auctioneer, right? Back in the day, trying to, even sitting still, getting a briefing over the phone was really hard to do. So even really not smart to be driving at the same time, right? I did miss that one NOTAM, and I'll get to what it was in just a second, but it was a night cross country. Take one of my students on a night cross country. We get all the way to our destination, go to the CTAF, click it 5 times, nothing happens. Click it another 5 times, nothing happens. Eventually we decided it was probably smarter just to go around, move on to our next destination. But when I got back, I went through our briefing a little bit better. Turns out I had missed the NOTAM where they changed the PCL to a different frequency. Had I just taken a little bit more time, I would have caught that. And it wasn't a big deal. We made arrangements, and we just thought smarter of it and moved on. But it really did remind me that you gotta pay attention to this stuff, and you do need to. You can cherry pick, but you need to move on to a standard approach. So, so that being said, it's mission based, right? We know we should know our mission. So if we know our mission, we can really boil it down to 3 different scenarios, right? We can do our airport environment, or our home airport. We can then maybe start looking at what it looks like to get out of our home environment and start going somewhere else. And then we can move on to a big flight. So maybe like something maybe you did all the way from the West Coast all the way out to Oshkosh or something like that, okay? So my question for you is, can you break down each of these scenarios for us and kind of move through what it looks like for Jason to go through maybe a local flight at his home airport, or like I said, move on to cross-country style flying? So
for sure. So back to the idea that I want to give people a license to do what they're going to do anyway. I'll be doing these lessons where we'll go down to the airport, and my students know all we're going to do is stay in the pattern. Let's just use this as an example. We're going to stay in the pattern today. We're going to do touch and goes, or like any of you guys are going out to the airport to do like a currency flight. So you're not really leaving your home base. Maybe you're going out to do like 3 full stop landings or whatever, but you're staying at your airport. And I would ask my students, hey, did you get the weather? And they would always say, yeah, I got the weather, and they would tell me the METAR. Right? They would tell me what the current conditions are. I got the weather. It's 260 at 10 knots, and temperature's 15 degrees. The sky's clear. We're good to go. But that's all they got is the METAR at the airport. And I said, well, we're going to be out there for 2 hours. What does the forecast look like? And so then they tell me what the TAF or the MOS looks like. But the bottom line is, I started thinking about it, and it's like, listen, if I ask these people to go get a full weather briefing in ForeFlight and study every page of it for a simple mission like touch and goes, they're not going to do it. And even worse, they're going to start to condition themselves that you don't need to do it when you fly, right? So back to the idea that we're going to give you a license to do what you will naturally do. The statement is, when you're not leaving the airport area, if you're going to stay at the field you're flying at, you really only need to check 4 things. So cherry pick all you want, look at the weather all you want, look at whatever occurs to you. Of course, if you find something during that process that causes you to not fly, like winds are gusting 40 or whatever, then obviously you're not going to fly. But if you go through that, and feel free to look at whatever you want, just cherry pick away. But then, if you're going to go flying, make sure you check these 4 things: the current conditions, the forecast conditions, the NOTAMs, and TFRs. That's what you need to know if you're staying at your local airport. Okay, so now if I say, did you get the weather? They know they're expected to have checked the METARs, the forecasts, whatever it is, the NOTAMs, and the TFRs. And if you're not leaving the local area, you're not violating any laws there. You remember the pre-flight law 91-103, the one that the FAA says you must do this. It always starts with for flights not in the vicinity of an airport, right? So for flights not in the vicinity of the airport, we'll talk about in a minute, but for flights in the vicinity of the airport, cherry pick all you want and then just check those 4 things before you fly. And that will give you a license to behave how you will probably behave anyway, and you're not lying to yourself or me or anybody else.
That makes a lot of sense to me, because if you really think about it from my perspective, there's 2 things that are kind of burn you. One is your inability from your own skill set, right? So if you're not checking the current conditions or forecast conditions very well, you could be getting out into a crosswind condition that you're not able to handle, or just any kind of weather condition that is beyond what you're able to do. And that's pretty straightforward. We can all appreciate that. But the bigger thing is, now we're talking about legalities, right? What are the things that can burn you legally, right? That we all hear it all the time on different aviation publications about how the XYZ pilot flew through the presidential TFR, or you hear it in the news how the president had to hide in the basement because some guy in a 172 flew, through a TFR or whatever. So yes, we understand skill set issues, but legalities that continues to plague our industry, not checking things that are beyond us, beyond our personal little circle, about what does it look like to fly in this environment.
Yeah, 100%. And the TFRs are super important. It's not just those NOTAMs about closed runways, but TFRs can pop up at any time, almost anywhere for sporting events, like you said, presidential TFRs. This is kind of a funny story, but did you hear the one, this is a true story, but there was a guy who was smuggling drugs in Southern California and forgot to check the TFRs. And when he took off, he launched into a presidential TFR, and that was the end of his drug running career right there. So if any of you have aspirations, don't forget that story.
Yeah. That's probably the same guy that would taxi his twin into the hangar with the engines running.
Maybe. This is kind of like Darwin Awards, but it's a memorable one anyway.
Well, cool. Okay. So that's, I showed a slide earlier about the funnel, and these are all parts of the funnel. Jason, you missed it, but we don't really need to go into this. You've already explained this. But
yeah, this is the way I would think about the next scenario. So we're going to talk about flying from point A to point B on a relatively short cross-country flight, Oshkosh to whatever, Madison or something like that.
All right, so we're getting into the moderate cross-country. So, the $200 hamburger, right? You're going to go from your home airport, the place that you're really comfortable with, that you've done your 4 things that you've covered that, but now we're actually going to get a little bit, more creative, if you will, a little bit more involved. And so take us through what it looks like to do what we call a moderate cross-country.
Yeah, for sure. Can we go back to that prior slide while I say this, though? This one? Yeah. So the funnel here is meant to represent the cherry picking, which again, it's what we all do. So let's include it. Let's make it part of what really happens, because it is what really happens. So you pick up ForeFlight. You're going to fly from Oshkosh to Madison. That's a cross country, right? Oshkosh to Madison. Anyway. You're going to fly like 50, 60 miles away, something like that. It's not days of flying like I'm going to do on Sunday. You're not going from here to California, but you're flying not in your local area. So first of all, you are required legally to check the weather, know everything about the weather. That's 91-103. But the way it starts is the same way it would start for any flight on ForeFlight. Feel free to just sort of look at what you want to look at based on what you think. Obviously today, radar is probably not a big deal. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Winds, I might load winds today. Is there any turbulence out there? So whatever occurs to you, cherry pick your way through that funnel. The only difference now is you are legally required at the end of that process, assuming you didn't find anything that causes you to not fly, because if you find something that causes you to not fly, you're not going to fly. That's fine. But assuming you don't, you end up at the skinny end of this funnel. At that point, you need to take your flight plan, send it to the flights tab, and get an actual briefing through ForeFlight. And this will be a standard weather briefing. Has everyone seen the way the standard weather briefings look in ForeFlight when you send it to the flight tab? Has anybody not seen that? Okay. All right, awesome. Well, thanks for saying that. So, you start on the maps page where your flight plan is. You put in your route, point A, point B, right? You design the whole route. You can touch it. You can bend it. You can make it look the way you want it to look. When you have the route all done on your maps page, drop your little flight plan down where your nav log is, and you'll see a send to button, like you need to email something to somebody. It's like a little file that looks like it's going to go away. Tap that, and it'll give you options. You can send this plan here to the flight tab, and that's what you want to do in ForeFlight. You send it to the flights tab, and from there, once that launches that page, you'll see Get Weather Briefing. And it will download and present a really nice standard weather briefing with images and text, and it can be, the text is undecoded so you can read it. And at this point, it is your job to study that briefing, okay? Because you're not staying at the local airport anymore. You're not just in the pattern. You're going from point A to point B. You did not find anything in your cherry picking that would cause you to not fly. So now you have to study that weather briefing. And that takes a minute, to be quite honest. But hey, look, back in the day, it took a minute to talk to a briefer, and you ended up not really knowing that much anyway, right? So we're going to take that process from the past and apply it to ForeFlight. This is your phone call, but it's on ForeFlight. And you go through that briefing. The NOTAMs, you have to study those. That's probably the hardest part of those briefings, and I guess we could talk about those specifically, but that's the idea.
Yeah, so to let you know, there's 2 different types of briefings within ForeFlight. There used to be 3. There was a classical text that we used to have, but we got rid of it because no one was really using it, and it was kind of boring. We have 2 that you're going to be using today. One is a graphical HTML. HTML is basically web pages. So when you tap this briefing, and these are done in settings, by the way, so you can choose which one you like. Most people gravitate towards the graphical HTML because it literally walks you through step by step. This is an example page of what the graphical HTML looks like. And it walks you through a briefing just like a briefer used to do back in the day. Going to start with those most adverse conditions, TFRs, convective segments, those kind of things, and just walk you through. Not only is it going to walk you through step by step, it's also going to understand what time you're taking off. If you have some performance data planned in ForeFlight, it'll also know what your passing times are going to be through specific things. So for example, if a TFR is going to be active as you're passing through that area, it will let you know you have it will predict that this TFR is active at your passing time. So it's really helpful. And I'm such a visual learner, again, I kind of knew I was doing a bad thing when I called the briefer from the car, for A, because it's just not really a smart thing to do, but B, because I'm a visual learner. I need to see something. This allows you to see information and study it and absorb it at your own pace.
Yeah, 100%. And you guys see that thing that Chris just said on the left up there, where it says like adverse conditions, synopsis, current weather, forecast, cloud coverage, all that. That's the order of a standard briefing, only we never had visibility into that before. Like if you were, really pushing your student, you could say, give me all the elements of a standard briefing, and they might be able to say, well, we start with the warnings, and then we get a synopsis. But we didn't really have that visibility. And now you can see you have the overall high altitude picture of where you are in the briefing. You also have a graphic picture showing you what the flight category looks like, and you have text below it. It's pretty incredible.
So those any picture you see, tap on it. If you haven't learned by now in ForeFlight, if you want to know more information about something, tap on it. If you see it, tap on it. So when you tap on it, it'll bring it up into a bigger, you can zoom. I mean, it's really interactive and dynamic. Another thing about these briefings is once you generate it, it stays in that flight. So if you're mid-flight and you remember, oh, there was something in that briefing, what was that? Just simply go back to the briefing section and it'll pull it back up for you. So it's a briefing that goes with you, and that's really cool. Okay. The other briefing that we have is a graphical PDF, and just like it says, it's a PDF. So it kind of scales it down a little bit. It's just more of a kind of a running page. And our professional pilots tend to gravitate towards that a little bit more. They just kind of want to know the basic information and get going, okay? But for most of our general aviation pilots, you're going to like that graphical HTML. So very cool. And use the hamburger, we call that the Hamburger Menu. That's really just the ability to move what you're looking at. So you can kind of move around at will. I suggest using the next button on the first go around, and then if you want to go back and study something more, use the Hamburger Menu, and then you can go in the catalog there. Okay. And
one thing I'll say about the NOTAMs, like for a really long time, I thought, with this format, I'm like, it takes, you have to really study through that list, right? You guys break them up into like departure NOTAMs, en route NOTAMs, like service NOTAMs, all sorts of different categories, and there's a lot of them. And I would play this game with my students, as the world was transitioning from phone calls to ForeFlight. I would say, hey, look, get the weather however you want. As long as I don't know more than you do, we're good, right? And I would call a briefer, and briefers typically suck. It takes a long time to get a hold of them. I don't even, often you can't get a hold of them anymore. But the one thing they were good at is NOTAMs. They would just tell you the NOTAMs that apply. Hey, when you're going to this airport today, the VASI's out. You guys are going to, the VASI's out on this runway, or the approach minimums have changed. So that's a real challenge for a product like ForeFlight because, often my students would go through that list and not actually get that data, right? They're looking at 85 NOTAMs, and I show up at the plane and say, hey, did you know the VASI lights are out today? And they say, oh, I must have missed that one. It's like, okay, which other ones did you miss, right? So the whole point is ForeFlight has really solved that problem by disseminating those NOTAMs all across the app. So like if you look at my example of sitting out there in the run-up area with that student and the runway was closed, if you have a taxi diagram up on ForeFlight these days, there's a big red banner at the top saying there's a NOTAM for this airport. If you're flying an approach into that airport and you load the approach page, there's going to be a big red flag at the top that says NOTAM. So those are things that you can tap on throughout the app that are, if you see a big red thing that says NOTAM, tap on it, right? And just see what that says. But your job in this briefing process is to study those NOTAMs as best you can but then also know that ForeFlight will, like, kind of has your back, and throughout the app in different places where those NOTAMs apply, you'll see them again, just as warnings, just as reminders for you.
There's really good redundancy in this. So when you are getting a briefing and you're going through the NOTAMs, we all know NOTAMs it's a big animal, right? There's a lot of information, and it's kind of a broken system, and the FAA definitely needs to probably look into that. I've heard rumors that they are trying to improve the NOTAM system. So until they do that, ForeFlight is, ForeFlight is here, and our job is to make information gathering more palatable, right? So what we've done is we've tried to compartmentalize this large chunk of data. Okay, so yes, and I did not mean to push the button. I apologize. So what we're trying to do is in this, we've done a lot of work to understand what pilots want to see in a briefing. So we have really done our homework on NOTAMs in a briefing, but we've also parsed them out and put them into the most logical place that you would want to find them within the app elsewhere. So what we're really getting at here is some redundancy with NOTAMs, right? So making them very smart on, like you said, the red banner, making them in different parts of the app where they're applicable, right? So if it's an airport NOTAM, you're going to see it in the airport tab. If it's an FDC NOTAM about an approach, it's going to be in that approach, right? But we're also going to do a really good job of parsing them and laying them out in a very easy to read format in the briefing. So at this point, you should be pretty good to go with NOTAMs if you're using ForeFlight, all right?
Yeah, no, it's true. Yep.
Okay, so we are now going to start getting out there. We're going to start seeing the world a little bit. So now instead of just going and getting that $200 hamburger, you're going on that big trip that you've been waiting for all year. You're going to go from, Oshkosh to XYZ, or from wherever you live in the world all the way to Oshkosh. So let's go ahead and spend some time here, take our time, because this is a big animal, right? We're doing a big job here. Obviously, it's going to require a lot more situational awareness, a lot more information gathering. What does it look like for Jason Miller when he's teaching his students, hey, we're going out and we're going to see the world? What does it look like for you to walk your students through that process?
Yeah, well, this one really applies to my flying these days, even more than a lot of the students. But I have to fly back to California on Sunday. So every morning when I wake up, I look, the first place I'm going to go let me just back up a little bit. So flying back to California is going to take 2 days, right? So I'm going to be flying all day Sunday, and I'll arrive midday on Monday, in all likelihood. That is if the weather holds, right? And you're crossing a much larger geographical region. I'm not just going to Madison anymore. Now I'm going all the way across the country. So usually the first place that I start is with the Prague Charts. So I'll just go right to the imagery tab. And by the way, if you do something different, like ForeFlight is so huge at this point. There's so much in there. Don't feel bad if you have a different way of doing this. I'm just going to share what my process is, and we'll have a chance for a Q&A at the end if you guys have questions or want to talk about it. But usually the first thing I'll do is look at the imagery tab along the bottom. I'll look at the Prague charts, and I'll just start looking. This morning I looked 48 hours out, and I looked at day 3, the day 3 Prague, right? Because what day is today? Thursday. Okay, today's Thursday, so I've got 3 days, and I have to go. And I just start looking at that big picture. You can do that for any flight, of course. You could do that if you're flying at the local airport. You could do that if you're flying to Madison. But certainly if I'm going to be crossing the country, it gives me a good look at the whole United States, and it sort of shows me where the fronts are going to be and where they expect convective activity to be, and just start to get a feel for what I might be dealing with. And by the way, when I looked at it this morning, if anybody's looking at ForeFlight, it looked to me like there was going to be 2 high-pressure systems moving into the Great Basin 3 days from now, and so, knock on wood, looks like I'm going to be flying through high pressure.
Just so people know, you might see the word featured up there. When you're looking at weather products in the imagery tab, there'll be a star. If you hit that star, what you're saying is it's a favorite, and it will be stored into the featured. So kind of going back to the cherry picking a little bit, that could be part of your cherry picking process. So if you star and make an imagery favorite, I do that. I love Prague Charts. So I've got all the Prague Charts for my area starred as a favorite there.
And since you mentioned cherry picking too, I just want to point out that overall funnel approach is the same here. There's really nothing different about flying from Oshkosh to California as there is from flying, Oshkosh to Madison. It's just a chain of small cross countries, right? You're just gonna fly those cross country. So that process is the same. My cherry picking starts with the Prague Charts, but it will end in a formal briefing for every flight. Yeah.
There's also another feature in ForeFlight called the 10-day forecast. Show of hands if you've seen the 10-day forecast. Not a lot of hands. Okay, I don't have an example on the screen, but it's very easy. If you open up ForeFlight, you can go to the airports tab and type in an airport. There'll be a little WX button. If you tap that WX button, it will show you the 10-day forecast, but it's got an aviation twist to it. So it's got some really cool, if it's going to be VFR or IFR, what's the ceilings, what's the, so it's putting some aviation specific information to this 10-day forecast. There's 2 more tricks with that. Just pick a random spot on the maps tab and long press it. When it long presses it, it'll come up with a little sub tray. There'll be another little WX button. So it will give you the weather, the 10-day weather for that random spot that you put on the map.
And I want to just highlight this for a second because Chris, you told me, this is a feature, you're talking about there's so much in ForeFlight. This is a feature that I don't think I knew about until we did our webinar. And Chris brought it up. So I just want to make sure everybody understands what he's saying. Like you can touch anywhere on the map, on your maps page. Touch anywhere, doesn't matter where. Just hold your finger there and a little thing will pop up with a WX in the upper right corner. And when you hit that WX, ForeFlight will give you the forecast weather conditions interpolated for that point that you put your finger on. Just pretty unbelievable.
I'm all about TAFs and METARs and really I paid a lot of money to learn to fly. I'm sure you all did too. And I pride myself in being able to read aviation weather, maybe, as opposed to my neighbor who's not a pilot and wouldn't know the first thing about what he's looking at. But I also like that we are trying to add common sense. I mentioned human factors earlier. I love the METARs and the TAFs and be able to read that. But I also like to be able to just say, look, I just want to kind of look at some stuff and not have to think too hard sometimes, right? There's so much information coming at my brain these days, right? Yeah, I got kids, I'm sure y'all, I got a lot going on. So being able to look at that 10-day forecast and then also have a weather, kind of aviation weather twist to it really helps, okay? Another thing, and I'm sure y'all can relate to this, is when I'm PIC, flying my friends or family to different places and I'm gonna be doing a multi-leg, multi-day trip, whenever we get a place safely, the first thing I start doing is getting my phone out and start looking at the weather for our return flight, right? So the wife and kids and friends and family, they're enjoying themselves. We're at their Disneyland and they're having a great time. And I'm on my phone the whole time because I'm worried about what it looks like to get home, right? And I've got my instrument rating. I'm sure a lot of you do too, but I'm not out looking for trouble either, right? So I'm in my phone the whole time. Well, this, all the different weather products and all the different ease of use things in ForeFlight really help kind of calm my nerves and allow me to be more present, more in the moment and enjoy myself when I'm on location.
Yeah, that's great. So you want to keep talking about this long cross country?
Yeah, if you got more.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's probably worth pointing out here too that for anybody that doesn't sort of think about it this way or know this, ForeFlight kind of has 2 sides to it in a way. Like there's this flight planning tool that we've been talking about before you go flying. This is how you're going to use it before you go up there. This is how it relates to the standard briefings of yesterday. But it's also an in-flight tool. So if you have a Sentry ADS-B receiver and you bring that in your airplane, you can get dynamic conditions along the way. And we're not talking about launching without a briefing or not knowing what weather you're going to go into, but when I'm flying back to California on Sunday, I'm crossing so much ground, right? We're moving so fast that a lot of this stuff can be looked at in the airplane. The ADS-B receiver will bring all the weather updates into the airplane. I remember when, and many of you do too, but before GPS, right? Like we would have to stop and land and get one of those little pilot brief weather stations in an FBO and you'd try to figure out the weather, you'd make all sorts of notes and you'd sort of launch again. And then GPS hit like 2004 or so, something like that. And all of a sudden now you could draw these pink lines, right? Like I remember I had a Garmin 430 and I thought this is cheating. I mean, I see a thunderstorm 30 miles away over there. All I have to do is fly this way and keep putting in a pink line until it looks like it goes around the storm and then turn, right? And you can see exactly where that line's gonna go. ForeFlight is like that on steroids these days because it gives you all of that sort of route information that's easily bendable, easily changeable, but also all of the weather overlays on top of it. The radar overlays, the flight categories, the surface winds, anything you want to put down. All the power of that pilot briefing station in the FBO, but now on your iPad, in flight, dynamic, real time, and getting updates. So if you're not flying with a Sentry, you should grab one of those. That really adds a lot of power to the tool.
Yeah, it's all about situational awareness, right? It's about gathering information, having knowledge about what's going on around you. When you have knowledge and you have situational awareness, you can make better decisions. And we're all about making better decisions, because better decision making, better ADM means safer pilots, right? It means the feds stay away from you.
Yeah,
you stay out of their bad graces, right?
Right. I mean, and I think, I heard Mark Baker from AOPA say the other night that I think last year was it? I mean, anyway, don't quote me on this, but I think last year was the safest year in general aviation ever, or at least in a long, long time. And I think products like ForeFlight are part of that, right? That this is part of how that's happening. Again, I'll tell you a little story that I'm not particularly proud of, but it illustrates sort of life before ForeFlight. I was headed into Oshkosh, I think it was 2003, something like that. So before GPS, before all this fancy weather stuff, kind of guessing, and all the airports are showing clear, except, when I got my briefing anyway. And as we were coming out of Minnesota, we were coming out of Flying Cloud, Minnesota, and we had to cross the river. I think it's the Mississippi River there by Duluth. Do you guys know where I'm talking about? Anyway, massive fog and clouds had built up just over the river. Nowhere else, right? And this is the kind of stuff that you would have been able to see on flight category reports in ForeFlight. Like if I had the tool and I was flying dynamically, I would have been able to load flight category and see that all these airports had gone marginal VFR or IFR. And then I could try to get TOPS reports. Maybe there was PIREPs, right? This is all stuff you can get in the airplane today. But back in the day, you couldn't get that information. If you didn't get it in your briefing, you'd have to land and get another briefing or get a hold of flight service on the radio, stuff like this, right? Long story short, I had an inadvertent VMC into IMC as I was trying to climb over this thing, right? So I'm trying to climb over it. It's foggy below me. It's cloudy above me. I was in between layers, and before I know it, I'm in IMC, right? It's a legal mistake. It's a safety mistake. It was a mistake I've never made again. Well, almost never made again. So having ForeFlight in the airplane as a dynamic weather tool is a game changer. And so make sure you have that ability.
Another thing that makes it really dynamic is when you're using ATC services, right? When they're calling out different convective, pockets here and there. You have to kind of visualize it. They would say, oh, it's 30 miles ahead of you. It's about 10 miles wide. And if you're in the clouds, you're like, oh, you just take their word for it, okay? But now you actually have it on the screen in front of you, and you can work in concert with them and have a little bit more of an efficient and yet safe way around that convective activity. So you used to have to just take their word for it and do whatever they said. Now you can work with them and kind of be part of that process.
That's huge. Just having that, when I was talking about that auctioneer earlier where he's like, line 40 miles northwest of the Mustang VOR to that, you had no visibility. I mean, if I was looking at the lines he was talking about while he was saying it, it'd be a no-brainer. And that's sort of like what ForeFlight allows for.
And the same thing with traffic. How many times have I been told there's traffic, 10 miles, opposite direction, same altitude. I don't see him, but see him on the box. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I know I'm still looking for him. It's my responsibility to look for him, but I've already got some kind of representation to kind of put me at ease and know that I'm going to be just fine.
Yeah. And I also want to just maybe talk for a moment about the MOS forecast, the model output statistics. Have you guys seen that? Has anybody not seen that in ForeFlight? Oh, wow, you've all seen it. Okay, cool. Well, I just wanted to point it out because it does now allow for forecasts at airports that didn't previously have forecasts available. So 2 important forecasting tools. If you go to the airports tab, the MOS, the MOS, model output statistics, will give you a computer-generated forecast based on essentially upstream stations, right? So it takes data, there's no human being involved, it takes data from the weather upstream of the place you're looking at and sort of interpolates what might happen as that system moves over your airport and gives you a forecast. That combined with the tool that Chris pointed out where you long press the map anywhere you want, you can essentially get a forecast for wherever you're going, which is also really powerful.
And the forecast discussion.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's a huge one. I was going to leave that out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, go for it.
Well, yeah, just that so I'm trying to remember where it's located. If you tap forecast on the airport's tab over on the right, I believe, mid-page.
It's in the TAF section.
TAF, okay.
It says forecast discussion.
Yeah, forecast discussion, which is a text discussion, exactly as it is, that comes from the National Weather Service, I believe. So it's like forecasters, prognosticators that work for the National Weather Service having a discussion, like plain text. Like, here's what we expect. As this low pressure trough moves over the area, we expect the surface winds to pick up around 20 knots out of the east, or whatever it is, right? It's just a textual discussion, which really gives you a lot of information. That's also a very powerful forecasting tool.
Isn't that why we liked briefers back in the day? Is because they took this really, advanced, PhD level weather, aviation weather, and they just talked to you like a human being. And when you were done talking to them, if you were not driving, you actually could feel better that you got this feedback, right? So that's what I really like about the forecast discussion. It kind of gives that human element, like I said, like a lot of other things in ForeFlight with the 10-day and all that stuff. It's taking this really advanced stuff that we need to have to make good, safe decisions, but it's putting that human element on it, and I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, for sure. So just to kind of summarize where we ended up with that super long cross country, it's the same funnel process as it is for any other cross country. Feel free to cherry pick. The cherry picking might start with prognostic charts. It might start with MOS forecasts. It might start with tapping the map anywhere and getting a forecast like Chris said. It might start by reading the discussion. But do remember that at the end of all that, if you haven't found a reason not to fly, you have to send it to the flights tab and go through a formal briefing, just like you had to pick up the phone back in the day and go through a formal briefing. That will always happen unless you're not leaving the airport, where that 4 things thing that we started with. That's the only time you're not going to send it to the flights tab. And then, of course, the sentry in the airplane for this dynamic weather tool is essential.
Cool. Any final goodbyes?
I'm not going to say a final goodbye. Maybe a final farewell.
Final remarks.
No, I'm good. You got maybe questions?
Yeah. So just want to let you know one more time that we do have all the support you need. So throughout this meeting, you might have come up with some questions. You need some technical help. So we are going to move into some Q&A. So this gentleman.
All right, the question was, how do you find if there's layered clouds? And then the second part was something about MOFs and... How do you mean conflict? Like if the TAF and the MOS don't agree? Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so let's start with the second part of that, because I think I forgot the first part already.
I can help with the first part.
What was it? Okay.
I can help with the first part when you're done.
Well, yeah, I mean, the second part is, I think it's important to understand the difference between a MOS and a TAF as a human being, right? So there is a prognosticator. These are people that forecast the weather. That's their job. That's their business. That's what they do. They will look at model output statistics and add a human element, and that's how it becomes a TAF. And so if you look at where I normally fly in the San Francisco Bay Area, we've got a very specific microclimate, right? It could be foggy in San Francisco and it could be sunny in San Carlos. The winds in and these airports, if you don't know, are 10 miles away from each other, right? It could be 10 knots of wind at San Carlos and 30 knots of wind at San Francisco. So in my area, the MOS forecast is often wrong because the human being says, wait a minute, I've been forecasting the weather here for 40 years. There's no way it's going to go down like that. Here's what's going to happen. And they inject that human element. So I think knowing that will help you resolve some of that. If you have a TAF and a MOS, often I'll defer to the TAF for that reason. And then understand that the MOS is a tool that, it's a weather forecast. It's a weather guess. It may or may not be accurate. And I think it's important to remember that all weather forecasts are guesses. Like when my wife says to me, on a Monday, when she says to me, it looks like it's going to be raining Saturday, I mean, just laugh. And they're like, okay, that's whatever. Fiction, fantasy, I don't know. Who knows, right? Aviation can forecast weather 4 hours ahead of time with almost perfect accuracy, a day ahead of time with pretty good accuracy, Outside of that, it's serious guesswork, right? So just knowing that, you're going to have to figure out that conflict resolution for yourself and kind of not trust any of it. You know, like we used to say with the turn coordinator, when we had all those old turn coordinators and it would bounce around like left and right, my CFII would say, oh, just average it out. Just look at it and pretend it's doing something in the middle. It's kind of like that with the weather forecasts.
And then your first question, that's better shown live. So if you don't mind heading to Hangar C, going into the booth, we have lots of different ways to figure out cloud layers. We have different layers. We have altitude sliders. There's all over the app ways to figure out different layers of clouds. So it's better off showing you live on that.
Also real quick, for anybody that wants free stuff, I have a free thing for you after this talk.
Question, sir. Yes, sir. So that's a connectivity problem or issue. It's through the FPL tray. So if you're on the Maps tab, there's an FPL, okay? And this is assuming that you are connected to your panel through Bluetooth. This is assuming that you've gone into the More Devices tab and have verified that you are connected, right? And if those are all things, you should hit the FPL tray. You'll see a little transfer button. You hit that transfer and it should send it to your panel. If you're not getting that, well, you have to be connected. You have to be in your airplane. So you're not going to see it right now, okay? If you're not getting that, team@foreflight.com or go to the booth and we can help you more with that. Yeah.
Dude back there in the blue has been...
Yeah. How about this gentleman with the white shirt?
I got you.
Yeah. Got it. Do you want to take that or you want me? Okay. So there is no technically legal briefing. That is something that's been said for years and years. What you're trying to do is prove to the FAA if you were to get violated that you did something. Okay. So when you are a ForeFlight subscriber, you're using your own unique username and password on your device. Okay. And that would be between you and the FAA representative to show, okay, well, show me what you did. Show me how you missed or did or did not brief yourself. So there's no legal briefing, but what you're really trying to say is, can I prove to the feds that I did my due diligence? And the answer is yes, because you are your own unique user on ForeFlight. It's the same thing as back when DUATS. When you went to DUATS and logged in, no one else should have your password. So you were the one that went and got the briefing. It is the same thing with the briefer on the phone. They recorded your voice. You were able to prove that you did what you needed to do. And yes, I mean, for lack of a better, without getting too in the weeds with it, yes. Yes.
This guy right here in the blue-green shirt right there standing up, back a little bit.
There you go. ISA, I'm not fully understanding the question.
International Standard Atmosphere?
Okay. Well, basically, ISA is just what it should be, and the delta between what it should be as per performance for aircraft performance, higher or lower than that. So it's basically helping you decide: is it hotter than normal? Is it colder than normal? Because we all have to have some kind of baseline when it comes to aircraft performance, right? I mean, standard atmospheric pressure is used to come up with a baseline. So the plus or minus ISA allows you to figure out: am I going to get worse performance today? Better performance? Right? Does that make sense? So if you need more help with that, we can talk more about it at the booth. This gentleman.
I think the question was, how is the information gathered for the daily forecast, which is the one we've been talking about when you long press and you get like a 7 days. This gentleman was here saying sometimes it doesn't match the MOS and the TAF or whatever. So I think the question is, how do we get that data?
Well, we obtain our weather from different sources, mainly the National Weather Service. So this is probably something we probably could talk about more one-on-one. So it really just depends on where you're looking.
You know what's really educational too for anybody that hasn't done it is find a National Weather Service booth. I don't know if they have one here at Oshkosh. I'm sure they do. I've seen them at many air shows in the past. And start asking them about how they create their weather products. Like, how do you guys create a TAF? How do you guys create a MOS? Because a lot of this stuff is just getting pulled into ForeFlight from the National Weather Service. And you can learn a lot about the stuff you're asking by talking to them as well.
This gentleman's been waiting.
I'll be honest, I've made the transition, so I don't call anymore. I think ForeFlight's weather briefings have gotten to a place where they're superior in a lot of ways. And you know, part of it is the getting a hold of a briefer has become harder and harder and harder. You know, so like I was a big call guy. Like I said, I'll call. My students can get it through ForeFlight. As long as I don't know more than you do, we're good. But often I'm on hold for like 10 minutes going, I'm number 2 caller. I'm on hold for 10 minutes, you know. And so as that system got harder and harder to use, and as ForeFlight got better and better and better, the weather briefing in ForeFlight is great. The thing is, you have to have the diligence to get to the skinny end of that funnel, send it to the flight tab, and take the time it takes to study it. Take 20 or 30 minutes to go through that ForeFlight weather briefing and make sure you've extracted all the information. If you're willing to do that, it's as good, if not better, than calling.
I think it's the difference between just checking the box, like you know, to satisfy legal requirements, versus really being curious and wanting to know what the weather's doing. Those both need to be done, but it just depends on where you are in your mindset. So there was this gentleman. 1 second. Well, I am not a software designer, so I can take your feedback back to the folks that do that. We also have comment cards at the booth, so we can definitely write that down and get that. And that's why we're here, is to bring our real life users and take the things that you'd like to see back with us back to Texas. So, blue shirt.
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
What's the difference, and when you're flight planning, what's the implication of those two differences?
So the gist between composite and lowest tilt is, if you're on composite, you're seeing a huge swath of air mass that the radar system is taking a sample of and processing with the, yeah, it's taking the whole sky. Right? That we're talking a ton of data. Just think how large, you know, 3-dimensional space would be for radar to consume that data, process it, put it into the app, right? So you're going to get these huge radar returns. If you go to lowest tilt, what they've done is they've lowered the radar sweep to just above the surface. So you can see this firsthand. If you go to composite, you'll see it cover, you know, all of Wisconsin. You know, if let's say a huge storm's coming through, if you go to lowest tilt, now all of a sudden it will shrink in size. It's not because it's less of a storm, it's because only so much precipitation is making it to the ground, right? So you're able to kind of really pinpoint where the core intensities are with the lowest tilt. So they're both showing you the same thing, but one is more finite with the lowest tilt. Okay, is that explain?
Over here.
Well.
Yeah, I mean, I take it one. Yeah, I mean, like, so as Chris said, when you get a weather briefing, it is going to get your, what do you call it, time passing station or whatever. So it's going to factor in how fast you're traveling and what time the app expects you to arrive at a certain place. But like on my flight Sunday, I'll get a briefing probably for the whole thing leaving. I'll say I'm going from Lake in the Hills to Rock Springs, whatever. Wyoming, is that Wyoming? Anyway, heading out that way. And I'll get briefed for the whole thing, and it will tell me as I pass each station what's expected. However, remember what we said about forecasting, I only really trust aviation forecasts about 4 hours ahead. So I will get a briefing at each leg if it's weather critical. Like if I get out there and I'm seeing weather that's challenging, even though I got briefed and even though ForeFlight is getting my time passing station, it is going to be smart when I get to Omaha to have another look at it, get another briefing, and get updated data.
The general usage of ForeFlight is point to point, right? Take off, climb, cruise, descend, land. That's one flight. So if you're going to be doing 3 stops, you're going to make 3 different flight plans, and each one of those can have a briefing. But because it's so easy, I mean, I can literally build a plan in the flights tab in probably 10 seconds, 15 seconds, right? Because it's so easy, go ahead and make one from your original departure all the way to your final intended destination, even though you might not have the capability to do so in your airplane, but at least just kind of do a mock flight. And what does that briefing look like? You know what I'm saying? So you can get really granular, or you can get really big, and it's so easy to make a flight and then just delete it after you've done it if it's not a real flight. You don't. Do a fictitious flight from point A to D, right? Even though you physically can't do that in your airplane, do a point A to D, just brief it, check out the weather, because we're not talking about performance right now, we're talking about weather, right? But then when you're actually flying for performance reasons, you're going to point A to B, B to C, C to D. Okay? Yes, sir. Well, that's something that as a pilot everyone should know about. It takes time for that ADS-B information to be processed, sent to your device or to your airplane, and then even on top of that, it's going to be on that screen for X amount of minutes. When it's all said and done, that could be up to 15 minutes old. So ADS-B is not on board radar. You are not picking your way through storms, or you shouldn't be, at least. Yeah, there's a pretty recent crash where they kept skirting the edge of a thunderstorm, but really they were in it. They were not next to it, they were in it. They were just looking at returns that were 15 minutes old. So, this gentleman.
I like this one for size. It's a mini. I think the question was, what kind of iPad should you use with ForeFlight? What version of iPad? Yeah, I mean, you guys have a buyer's guide on the website, don't you?
This is exactly where the folks at the Hangar C would come in to help you. The gist of what we would love you to have the most, the newest iPad you can afford, okay? What happens is Apple stops supporting the older devices, so therefore ForeFlight can only build the app up to the old iOS. So we become hamstrung on the ability to support the older devices, right? They will not let us put an app in the App Store unless it's compatible with the newest iOS. So.
Yeah, and I should also say, this is a brand new iPad mini. I don't know what they sell for these days. I think it's $300 for a brand new iPad mini. In the world of flying, if you have to spend $300 every 3 years to get the most current device, I strongly recommend it. The performance of the newer devices is faster, the app works better. This is flying after all, it's not inexpensive. Through the ADS-B receiver, the Stratus. Yeah.
So to get in-flight data, you you are connected to some receiver that does that. So ForeFlight makes a Sentry, which is an ADS-B receiver, right? So the satellite system and the ADS-B system talk to the receiver, then the receiver through Wi-Fi talks to your iPad. Well, that's just a different version of that's just, Garmin's version of what we do for a Sentry. They all do the same thing. Just pick your what you like to use, So, all right. Well, looks like we're getting a little bit low on time. I'm sure there's some more questions, but this is our forte. Come see us, Hangar C, challenge us.
Thanks, guys. Have a great
All right. Everyone be safe. Thank you very much.